Everyone, and welcome to this webinar on achieving durable solutions for internally displaced persons in Iraq, challenges, opportunities, and possible remedies. My name is Beth Ferris. I'm a professor at Georgetown's Institute for the Study of International Migration, and delighted to be moderating this webinar that's being co-hosted with my colleagues at Georgetown's Center for Contemporary Arab Studies and with Mercy Corps. We'll hear about two exciting research initiatives, both of which that looked at some of the prospects for durable solutions for internally displaced persons, IDPs, in Iraq. I might just say as a word of introduction that I was privileged to serve the past couple of years as an expert advisor to the UN Secretary General's high-level panel on internal displacement. This panel was set up by the Secretary General first to draw more attention to IDPs, which frankly had fallen off the international agenda. You know, in 2018, we saw two new global compacts on migration and refugees, and neither one of them dealt with IDPs, even though IDPs number 50 million in the world today. And so the Secretary General decided it was time to take a deeper look at IDPs. So one of the purposes of the panel was to draw attention, to get the issue back on the international agenda, but secondly, to tackle this thorny issue of solutions. I mean, the fact is that most IDPs in the world have been displaced for some time, that we have new displacements every year on top of these long-standing, protracted situations. And so the Secretary General asked this panel of 8 people and 4 advisors to really spend some time and talk to a lot of people to come up with suggestions for how solutions could be found for IDPs. It was an intensive process. It happened during the pandemic. We had all these plans for field visits, which all fell apart, and everything was conducted by video conference. But over the course of 18 months, we had more than 80 or 100 conversations with people around the world, with government leaders and NGOs and IDPs themselves and UN agencies. And, you know, it seemed like every week there are 4 or 5 different meetings, and all of them were interesting and different. And, you know, the situations are different for IDPs and in Colombia and in South Sudan and in Northern Iraq. So it was really interesting to hear different perspectives on what is a solution, what contributes to solution. We know from the framework on durable solutions that solutions for IDPs are said to be found when people no longer have specific assistance and protection needs related to their displacement, when they can enjoy their rights on a par with others who haven't been displaced. But how do you get there? Particularly when people have been displaced for years, how do you get to a position where they no longer have needs related to their displacement? These, you know, people can be displaced in a matter of hours, but it can take months or even years to find solutions for IDPs. So the high-level panel made a bunch of recommendations. The final report was issued at the end of September. Secretary General is meeting next week to decide on prioritizing the more than 100 recommendations that were made, trying to support solutions for IDPs. But over and over again, what the panel found was that political will is key. If a government wants to support solutions for IDPs, things can happen. If a government doesn't even acknowledge internal displacement, as in places like maybe Syria or Myanmar, doesn't want to take it seriously, then it's very difficult for civil society actors and IDPs themselves to fill that void. And unfortunately, we really struggled. We spent several months with the question of how do you change the incentives? How do you make governments care about people displaced within their borders? And there simply aren't any easy answers, we concluded. So we made a number of suggestions for how solutions can be found for IDPs, most of which involve including all of government society, not just one ministry, but including municipal governments and different agencies within the country. And perhaps most important, civil societies. These issues are too complicated, frankly, and too important to be left to governments alone. So we need to have the private sector involved, and we need to have IDPs themselves showing leadership and agency and finding solutions. I think at the end of the process, we all felt quite humble at the limited nature of the tools that the international community in particular has to support these processes. So today we're going to hear about the quest for solutions in Iraq, particularly northern Iraq, those displaced by the violence of ISIL or Daesh. And really delighted to have 4 wonderful speakers today. I'm going to go ahead and introduce the 4 of them, and then we'll open up for a Q&A. Many of you have participated in webinars before and will be familiar with the little Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to enter questions anytime anytime you have a question, and we will get to those questions. We're going to start with the Georgetown team. We'll hear from Rochelle Davis and Salma Al-Shami, who've been working for a number of years with the International Organization for Migration in Northern Iraq, really studying a longitudinal study, which is really unique in the field of displacement studies, to look at IDPs over time. And they'll be telling us about their research. Rochelle is a professor at Georgetown's Center for Contemporary Arab Studies. She's written extensively on issues around refugees, war, conflict, affected communities in the Middle East. I think you began your work, Rochelle, working on Palestinian refugees, but you've certainly talked about Iraqi and Syrian refugees as well now as IDPs. And Salma Al-Shami is a statistician who's been working with the project. She's been teaching at Georgetown. Her specialty is quantitative methods, public opinion, civic participation, has really brought some needed skills to our team working on this project. We'll then turn to our 2 representatives of Mercy Corps, and I should say we're delighted to be partnering with Mercy Corps. I think academics and NGOs have a lot in common, and it's good to work together to kind of share our relative areas of expertise. Adam Lichtenheld is a senior researcher for peace and conflict at Mercy Corps. He's worked on conflict prevention, mitigation, resolution. He has a master's and PhD from Berkeley and has done some really interesting quantitative studies looking at the relationship between displacement, conflict, and solutions. And he's joined by Mohammed Ismail, who is a senior program manager for Mercy Corps in Iraq and is speaking to us today from Erbil in Iraq. And so we're delighted to have you, Mohammed and Adam, but for now, I'll turn the floor over to Rochelle and Salma, and we'll hear about the research that you've conducted. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Give me a second to share my screen. And if you could just confirm that you can all see it. Yes? Yeah.
Yes, we can see your screen.
Good. Great. Great. Thank you. Well, I wanted to start by thanking everyone, Maddie Fisher in particular for making this all happen for us, and to Mercy Corps and Adam and Muhammad for reaching out about this and getting us started. And of course to Beth, thank you. It's always wonderful to be on a panel with you because I always learn so much. So I'm looking forward to this day today. We wanted to just note that our presentation today expresses only our views of Selma and I, and they don't reflect the International Organization for Migration's positions. And this partnership also that we've done for 6 years now was funded as part of a grant from IOM part of a grant to IOM from the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration of the US State Department. And we're going to start just by giving some brief background, and then we will go through the findings and then also come up with some suggestions. Let me go into presentation mode. 1 second. Sorry about that. There we go. You can always just interrupt me, Selma. Selma and I are going to tag team this and go back and forth. So we have practiced, so we will hopefully be smooth. So here's what we'll do. We'll talk about the study purpose and design, then the findings, and then we're going to really focus on compensation as one of the issues that you raised, Beth, which was kind of thinking about the political will and sort of what the Iraqi government has been doing and where it has been slow. So one of the things that we really worked on was these research questions, which we started with more than in 2015 as the project was being created. How do displacement and access to durable solutions among IDPs in Iraq change over time? So this panel study, this longitudinal study, really allowed us to kind of think through and answer some of this big question. And then what are the needs, coping strategies, and aspirations of IDPs? And what events and factors are perceived to influence these over time? And then finally, to what extent do the experiences of IDPs in Iraq inform our conceptualization and operationalization of quasi-durable and durable solutions? And this last question, I think one of our takeaways, and we will come back to this, was how much Iraqis, both displaced people themselves, their families, their friends, and the communities that hosted them were essential to the survival and of IDPs, because they were the ones who provided the most at all, and in constantly providing that. And so I think it's really important that we will focus on Iraqi IDP sort of initiatives and agencies throughout, because that's really what came through in the research. And one final note that I want to put in here before we go into the findings. We worked with a team of Iraqi research assistants. We started with 25, 28, and then have worked with many of them over the 5 years of this project, and they were amazing. And I think it really is a tribute to the Iraqis who participated and the Iraqis who did the work, that they were so crucial to us being able to have this window into what was happening in IDPs' lives. But they really get all of the credit for making all of this happen, and for being so deeply concerned about what was happening in their country. And
so as Beth briefly spoke about to start, the study was based on the Interagency Standing Committee's framework on durable solutions. That was key in helping us set up, how exactly we were going to measure one of the attainment of one of three possible ends to displacement that the framework defined. So return, relocation, and reintegration. So, and as was previously mentioned, one of the things that really set the study apart was its construction as a panel study. So re-interviewing the same families over 6 years almost, and that has several upsides. Some of which are just kind of being able to control for outside factors that might otherwise influence different populations over time. So by keeping the families the same over these 6 rounds, we were kind of able to see the development of stories particular to those families. There have been 6 rounds of data collected so far. I should say the majority of our presentation today will focus on data collected through round 5, which was completed in 2020. We do have a 6th round of data. We will speak to that very briefly at the end of our presentation, but and we can talk more about this in the question and answer session, but one of the key reasons is that a report on the 6th round of data suggests that the pandemic really affected some of the key some of the progress made in some of the key indicators. So kind of holding that to kind of keep it a little simpler for right now, and then certainly being able to speak to some of those changes and foreshadow the report that will hopefully come out later this month. We're going to stick to speaking to the 5 rounds of data. I should also say that the study tracked these families as they moved around in Iraq. So the study internally defined 3 separate groups: IDPs, who remained IDPs, that is, they remained in the same place over time; movers, who moved around within Iraq but did not return to their districts of origin; and then finally returnees, who at various stages did start making their way home. By the 6th round, it's still about 30% who were returnees, and it's still upwards of 60 who remain in displacement after 6 years. The study has two components to it. It has a quantitative study, a survey of households, and qualitative interviews. So the quantitative survey was fielded with all households, and the qualitative interviews were conducted with 80 households per round. Additionally, we conducted interviews with other affected populations, such as the host community, government officials, humanitarian aid organization, and education professionals along the way, to give us a more comprehensive view of kind of how these different segments of society were all affected by displacement. The study actually makes several inroads that set it apart. So first, really was an attempt to translate the 8 solutions, the 8 criteria, into measurable indicators and observable outcomes that hopefully can be reproduced or improved upon elsewhere, should a study like this come to fruition again. Second, with its the study focused on the non-camp population. It's a very hard to reach, yet it's actually the population into which most IDPs fall. So most IDPs are not based in camps. They are based outside of camps, yet there was a dearth of information on them. And third, both in its qualitative and quantitative components, so even the qualitative interviews are actually longitudinal, make it unique and give us the ability to track these changes over time. And finally, we are glad to announce that as of this summer, the data is now publicly available. And can be found on our website. To speak a little bit about who is in the study, so the households were originally displaced from one of 7 governorates of displacement, from Anbar, Babylon, Baghdad, Diyala, Kirkuk, Ninwa, and Salah ad-Din, and they were displaced to Baghdad, Basra, Kirkuk, and Slemania, the 4 governorates to which, or in which the survey was actually fielded. Through 5 rounds of data collection, 3,463 of the original 3,852 families remain in the study. That's approximately 90% retention rate. Geographically, we included households that were from areas with high concentrations of IDPs, as you can kind of see there on the map, around Baghdad, around in the middle and Kirkuk, but also places that had fewer IDPs, to kind of see this variation of, you know, whether or not services and difficulties were the same based on the levels of IDP concentration. These 4 governorates where we fielded the survey were actually home to 34% of all Iraqi IDPs. And again, it generalizes to the non-camp population of IDPs. And the findings that I'll speak to, and that Rochelle and I will speak to today, are among those IDPs who have remained IDPs over time. We did track returnees, we did track movers, you know, that it's a bit of a separate population. So we can certainly answer and speak to those later on in our question and answer, but we'll focus on IDPs who have remained IDPs over time. To speak a little bit about, you know, some of the key challenges and solutions, what the challenges IDPs were facing and how they overcome them. We're going to speak to some of the 8 criteria. I should note off the bat that family reunification, loss of documentation, and participation in public affairs, 3 of the 8 criteria were never as big a problem for this non-camp population. So we're going to focus on 5 of the others. The first of which is security, of course. And one of the key things is that it was, you know, it's a necessary step towards a solution, but it's certainly not sufficient. One of the main challenges that, and where a lot of the core, the center of the study was focused, was on this ability to meet basic needs and what that means. And mostly what we found is that IDPs are able to do so greatly thanks to their own initiative and their community support, host community support, and NGO and government support. But one of the reoccurring patterns is that displacement itself, the fact of being displaced, creates problems that actually prolong that displacement. So you know, that this kind of this endogenous chicken and egg problem of displacement creating conditions for further displacement was something we observed. Housing and employment in particular are two key challenges. Housing, of course, representing a large new cost for previous homeowners, and employment, of course, of having to find a different ways of self-supporting. And part of the issue is that IDPs were simply never able to find, or a big chunk of IDPs were never able to find employment in more stable sectors. And finally, one of the key takeaways from this is how much IDP's own agency was really a factor in facilitating their abilities to live in displacement, and how much the strategies that they devised were kind of key to making progress towards, if not attainment of, a quasi-solution, if not a fully durable one.
And I wanted to add on to what Selma was saying, was that one of the areas of study was in Suleimania in Iraqi Kurdistan. And so that adds a whole another interesting layer to all of this, to think about how an autonomous or a regional government also addressed the issues of IDPs. And so that's part of, you see some of that in our reports as well, discussing that. So I'm going to talk about sort of this first issue of safety just quickly. When we asked about how they felt pre-displacement, you see that it was quite low at 67% felt completely or somewhat safe. And that going into displacement made them feel much safer. So it's sort of, it's both obvious, but it's really clear that safety was something that was achieved by people leaving their homes. And I mean, I think that's obvious, but it really isn't a catch-all solution, because it, of course, creates other issues. And this is where we see meeting basic needs. So while they didn't feel safe necessarily in pre-displacement, they were able, for the most part, 96% to provide for their basic needs. And then it drops precipitously and never, ever really gets close again to pre-displacement levels. And we sort of track that over time. When we look at the consequences of trying to meet their basic needs, we have the main coping strategies for doing that are, we asked people about that. And as you can see, in all the rounds which are on the screen, really borrowing money was, of 4 of these 5 rounds, 3 of these 4 rounds was really how they were able to provide for their basic needs, which really, I think, and who they borrowed money from was friends and family, was people close to them. And so one of our conclusions is that keeping that by having to borrow money in order to survive, they really are keeping the burden of displacement on those closest to them. And so it becomes very that people have to turn to communities around them in order to make it through this, and that those people are the ones all bearing the burden together. The other finding is that significant portions of IDPs reduce food and other expenses to make ends meet, and this really got much more pronounced over time. And then debt is a long-lasting consequence of displacement. And we asked a lot about that. You know, have you borrowed money? Have you been able to pay it back? And so we have statistics on that as well.
There are multiple factors that contributed to being able to provide for basic needs, of course, some of which are IDP's own strategies, but at least 2 others, humanitarian aid and employment, really are the key to doing that. Humanitarian aid over time significantly decreased. In round 1, this is in 2016, where most IDPs had been displaced between 2014 and 2015 in the study by Daesh. The Iraqi government, and specifically the Ministry of Migration and Displacement, the MOMD, provided what was called the millioniyya, so a 1 million one-time payment of Iraqi dinars to those who had been displaced. And the vast majority of those in the study did appear, 96% in round 1 reported actually getting that. But then over time, you know, in round 2, so in 2017, aid organizations and the central government, the international aid organizations, I should specify, really had stepped up in trying to provide items. But then by round 3, the aid basically ceases. We commensurately saw a shift in the types of aid and the providers of aid. So in the beginning, while it was cash, and non-food items that were being provided primarily from the government and from international organizations. By round 5 and round 6, the providers of aid had shifted to local NGOs and to, again, family members and friends, and had shifted in kind from non-food items and cash to food and water and kind of other forms of basic need. So this goes back to the point Rochelle actually just made about the burden of displacement really being placed on those most proximate to the IDP families themselves. So they're having to borrow money, but they're also relying on donations of food and in-kind donations from those around them. And of course,
Selma, 1 second. Beth, do we have 5 minutes left or?
Yes, you're fine on time. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
So employment is one of the things that actually complements the ability to provide for basic needs. And we've seen a few things. First, that most IDPs are actually earning income in the informal labor sector, which of course is known for its low wages, its poor labor protections, and its inconsistency of work. And that share rises dramatically from about 20% pre-displacement to around 40% in round 5. Furthermore, we have seen that the agricultural sector has never really rebounded. And of course, it drops from 20% to less than 1%. And of course, this contributes to the idea of rising food prices, where food in round 5 accounted for 33% of monthly budgets or monthly expenses, sorry. And also, people having to cut down, as Rochelle showed, on the amount of on their food intake. The other interesting thing here is that while we see some of these shares, particularly, for example, in the public sector, start to rebound to pre-displacement levels, it's not actually the same households. So those who are working in the public sector pre-displacement are not the same ones who are working in the public sector in round 5, even though the share is now 19% on the bookends of the displacement process. So this, I think, speaks to the ingenuity of IDPs and kind of figuring out these new solutions of trying to find employment and trying to support their families. That said, employment is also the place where we see the greatest share, though a minority, it's a significant minority, 37%, say that they face discrimination in accessing it. Other than that, for civil status services like getting marriage documents, birth certificates, driver's licenses, housing, healthcare, and education, IDPs, minorities say that they always or sometimes face discrimination in accessing these types of services in the areas to which they were displaced. So they're facing challenges. It's just not necessarily that they're facing challenges disproportionately to others in the host community members with respect to these 5 items.
So we want to kind of focus on a key finding where we saw that there was particular opportunity for interventions, and that is the compensation for lost property. And we really see that that is a key to ending displacement. And we will talk about that for the next sort of section. Compensation alleviates financial strains. Obviously, it provides the answer for, as the international humanitarian community and aid community thinks about sort of emergency crisis assistance versus sort of long-term development assistance, compensation is a really important sort of transition moment for IDPs who, if they can receive compensation, can sort of move between one and the other. It also constitutes a really important element, as we'll show, about what IDPs in Iraq are identifying as access to justice. And then it also allows them to sort of have a choice in whether they go home or how they go home. And so that's really important. Why compensation? I think one of the findings out of the study that's been sort of eye-opening for us was really how much housing costs while living in displacement take a huge chunk out of people's, sort of income, because, and in part, this is even more exacerbated by before displacement, many people owned their own home. So when they get displaced and all of a sudden having to pay rent is a expense that they haven't had before. So you can see 79% of owned a home before displacement. And then, as you can see, the number of renters or those who rent alone or with others it's like it sort of flip-flops. And you can see the costs both for food and for housing here. Housing really represents a key challenge to return because of the conditions of the houses in the places where they came from. So we asked them what the condition of their property was in these 5 rounds, and you can see many people didn't know. And then when they did actually know, it was destroyed or heavily damaged or partially damaged. That's a huge proportion. And there's things we can say about this, but I think it's really critical. One of the things that comes out of what we've been talking about with IDPs when they talk to us, particularly those who return, is that even if their house is standing, if the services around them, if the roads, the hospitals, the clinics, the infrastructure, the schools, et cetera, are not serviceable, then they don't have much incentive to return, even though they may be able to and want to rebuild their houses. So part of housing is just one part of a whole kind of package of rebuilding. So compensation is provided by this committee with a very long name, لجنة تعويض المتضررين جراء العمليات الحربية والأخطاء العسكرية والعمليات الإرهابية. It's part of the General Secretariat for the Council of Ministers, and it was established in 2009 to really look at what had happened, before 2003 and after the U.S. invasion and et cetera. And so it's a longstanding committee that's been working through these issues, and it takes a long time. In 2016, they were dealing with cases from sort of 2011, et cetera. So it's been a very slow process, and that's a real problem. In compensation, the applications for compensations have increased dramatically over time. So they were opened up, I think, people were applying, but really in sort of 2018, 2017, they were opened up. And you can see that 59% of IDPs had applied by round 5. And there's a but here. The number who had actually received compensation has and remains particularly low. As you can see on the right side, the status of their compensation claims. 96% of those who had applied had in round 4, their claim was pending. Only, I can't even tell what that is, maybe 1% had been accepted. By round 5, 9% of those who had applied had been accepted. So this is the problem primarily, is that that they are or their claims have been rejected. So it's kind of a sad state that almost as many were rejected as have been accepted in round 5. I think compensation would be really critical to also facilitating the rebuilding of trust in the government. So if IDPs are receiving this kind of thing from the government, which has been promised to them, and they receive it, it would be a good step towards people beginning to believe the government again. And as you can see, knowledge of and access to compensation sort of go together.
The final kind of piece that compensation really plays into, and here is where we'll bring in round 6 a little bit, because this was one of the most dramatic changes, is this idea of justice and its evolution over time. So up in and through round 5, up in and through round 5, IDPs really define justice in terms of the prosecution of criminals and really, acknowledging the wrongs that have been done against them. We think what happened here is that when the pandemic really exacerbated the economic strain on IDPs, there was a commensurate shift in what justice meant to really shifting the focus more towards compensation for those violations, so that it's no longer just about prosecuting criminals, but it's recuperating some of what was lost, at least in terms of property. And that's exactly that drop that you see between rounds 5 and round 6, where it drops to under a majority who had previously said that it's the prosecution of criminals, to now it's basically tied between prosecution of criminals and compensation for violations that are the most important aspect of achieving justice. A part of this is also, taking into consideration what IDPs want. So over time, we asked explicitly what constitutes justice, but there are other kind of ways from our study that suggest what justice means. Over time, IDPs in displacement say that they are feeling accepted in their host communities. Those two top lines are actually both feelings of acceptance, but to really differentiate this, it's just to see that those who are feeling strongly accepted in their host communities really rises over time. When taken together, it's upwards of 90% of IDPs in host communities that say that they are strongly or somewhat accepted. That said, however, Rochelle, can you go to the next slide, please? It doesn't mean feeling accepted does not actually mean that they want to stay where they are. So in round 6, when we asked, do you still consider yourself displaced? 85% say yes. Among those 85%, when we ask why that's the case, 57% say because they haven't returned home, that is to their physical address, and 27% because they haven't returned at least to their general area. Among the 15%, however, who have landed in, who do feel that they're no longer displaced, 64% say it's because they have a network of family and friends. And to kind of put these two things together, feeling accepted and wanting to go home are not two sides of the same coin, right? People can feel like they have a place in their host communities, but that does not really make up for their ultimate desires. And finally, when we kind of think about the durable solutions more broadly, is that if IDPs play such an important part in and are responsible to a great extent for finding solutions to their displacement, if that is a responsibility, then one of the things that this study reveals is that it's perhaps also a right for them to have a say, that what they want should count for when displacement ends for them. And for those who are not feeling displaced, that does still mean returning home. So this is a bit of a teaser from what is hopefully to come later this month in our round 6 report that will focus on COVID-19, or that has a special section on COVID-19 that kind of shows how the pandemic changed these indicators over time. But we're happy to discuss any of this hopefully in our question and answer session. And with that, we'll hand it back to you, Beth.
Well, thank you very much, Rochelle and Salma. You presented a whole lot of information in a short amount of time, and there are just many questions that come about, how to interpret this, how to think about this sense of belonging, owning a home, compensation. But we'll have time for that in the Q&A. Please do. I ask participants to go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A. And we'll turn now to Adam and Mohammed and hear about a different but related research project on displacement in Iraq. Adam, I think you're going to start.
Yes, thank you, Beth. And I'm having some issues trying to share my screen. So if everyone can please bear with me. It looks like it is maybe working. Can everybody see?
Yes, we can see it.
Great. Well, thank you, Beth, and many thanks to Georgetown for being willing to co-host this webinar. I think this is obviously a really important topic, and we're really excited to be able to present some research and talk about a little bit of work that we're doing on some of these issues, and obviously also to hear about the really amazing work that Rochelle and Salma are doing with IOM. I'm going to talk a little bit about a study that I helped lead on behalf of Mercy Corps earlier this year, and then I'll turn it over to my esteemed colleague, Mohammed Ismail, who is working on the ground on addressing these issues, and he's going to talk a little bit about what Mercy Corps is actually doing to try to address some of these issues, and also just provide an update and a practitioner's perspective based on his vantage point on the ground. So our study was really motivated by the fact that, 5 years since the Iraqi government declared victory over ISIS or ISIL, whichever acronym you prefer, according to IOM, nearly 1.2 million people remain displaced and have not yet returned. Obviously, it's something that I think Rochelle and Salma's presentation really underscored. And I should say here that return obviously is not the only durable solution to displacement, but it has been the one that has been, I think, the primary focus of domestic and international actors in Iraq. And I think that Rochelle and Salma very nicely laid out, the various barriers to return that people face, right? Some of them are humanitarian, some of them are economic, whether it's lack of housing, damaged infrastructure, limited services and livelihood opportunities in areas of return. But other barriers, and this is what our study focuses particularly on, has to do with the social divisions that are a consequence of years of armed conflict in Iraq. And in particular, one barrier to the sustainable return and reintegration of IDPs is the unwillingness of some individuals and communities to welcome and live alongside returnees, which has been documented by IOM and some other studies, has discouraged people from returning or caused people to be redisplaced after attempting to go home. So at the end of their presentation, Salma really talked about social acceptance of IDPs by host communities. Here, we're talking about the acceptance of IDPs who are trying to return home back in their home areas. So it's a little bit different. And this has been a particular challenge in Nineveh governorate, where we've seen that Nineveh's ethnic and religious minority communities who were often heavily persecuted by ISIS, which compounded some of these groups' previous experience of discrimination, marginalization, and stoked fear and resentment, especially of the local Sunni Arab population. And so now some resist the return of Sunni Arab residents who they perceive as being ISIS members or supporters or complicit in enabling ISIS's crimes. So for this study, we thought that, understanding and trying to address the issue of social acceptance was really important, not just for ending Iraq's displacement crisis, but also for reconciliation, peace building, and preventing future conflict in Iraq. So to try to better understand the drivers of social acceptance in the context of return, in late spring, we conducted a survey of more than 500 Yazidi households from Sinjar district in Nineveh, including people who've returned to Sinjar and people who remain displaced in camps in Dohuk, to explore the conditions under which they were more or less likely to accept returnees. Many of you probably know that the Yazidis, Iraq's second largest religious minority, were especially targeted by ISIS and subjected to a campaign of mass killing and forced conversion that has been recognized by the UN as genocide. Now, we cannot claim that our survey sample is representative of the entire Yazidi population in Sinjar or in Nineveh more broadly. And we should obviously note that unlike Rochelle and Selma's study, this research focuses on a specific group in a specific district. So it's far less comprehensive. Yet, we think because of the area's ethnic and religious diversity, the atrocities perpetrated against the local Yazidi and other populations, and some of the intergroup tensions, that Sinjar presents an especially difficult context for achieving durable return and reintegration, partly for some of the reasons, again, that Rochelle and Selma discussed when it comes to destroyed infrastructure and housing and humanitarian needs, but also, again, because of some of these social dynamics and barriers to return. So we think it's particularly important to understand and explore in this context. So I'm going to walk through three main findings from this study. The first is that we found that returnees' movement patterns during ISIS rule shapes their social acceptance more than their ethno-religious identity. The second is that a sense of shared victimhood under ISIS makes Yazidis, especially male respondents in our survey, more likely to accept Sunni returnees. And third, Yazidi respondents who were displaced with Sunni Arabs and interacted with them more frequently were more likely to accept them into their community. So for the first finding, we conducted an experiment as part of our survey where we described a hypothetical returnee to survey respondents, and we randomly manipulated key characteristics about that returnee to see whether it affected their willingness to accept that returnee into their community. Specifically, we manipulated two main things. The first is their ethno-religious identity. So we randomly manipulated whether the returnee was a Kurd or a Sunni Arab. And then we also manipulated whether we described the returnee as someone who had fled Sinjar as soon as ISIS entered the area, which we call a leaver, so someone who fled immediately upon ISIS arrival, whether that person actually stayed in Sinjar or was a stayer, remained behind, and then eventually fled later, say after ISIS was expelled from the area, or someone who not only stayed behind, but actually worked in the government sector in Sinjar under ISIS. So essentially was a collaborator with the group. And then we asked people whether they would be comfortable with that particular person moving back to their community. One thing I want to note here is that in describing the profile of the returnee, we described in all cases, the person as a 35-year-old male. We had plans to try to manipulate the gender and age of the returnee, but because of our sample size, we had to limit the number of treatments essentially that we provided. So I just think that's important to note because it's certainly possible that some of the variation in responses that we see could be bounded by the fixed characteristics of this returnee profile. And had it been a returnee of a different gender or age, we might see different responses. So I just want to be upfront about that. And what we see generally is that, again, people's movement patterns during ISIS rule seem to be the more influential factor shaping social acceptance. So as you can see from this graph, nearly twice as many respondents were comfortable with a leaver than a stayer returning to their community, regardless of the returnee's ethno-religious identity. Identity did have an effect. There was a modest increase in acceptance if the returnee was a Kurd versus a Sunni Arab. As we would expect, Yazidis are ethnically Kurdish. Many of them sought sanctuary in the Kurdish region of Iraq, but the effect was relatively modest compared to the effect of people's movement patterns. And I think interestingly, the proportion of respondents who were comfortable with accepting someone who simply just stayed and lived under ISIS was relatively similar to the percentage that would be willing to accept a collaborator, someone who actively actually worked under ISIS. And if we, oops. Sorry, please bear with me while I try to.
Find your PowerPoint.
Yeah, it just disappeared on me.
If you go out of share screen, then you can come back in and just share your PowerPoint. Don't share your desktop.
Sorry, everyone. Oh, no. Okay, are we back now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. Flipping through too many windows. Anyway, the next thing I wanted to show you was if we break down the results by gender, the gap in social acceptance between stayers and leavers is even greater for female respondents, nearly twice as large, as you can see from this graph, as the gap for male respondents. And women generally were less comfortable than men with a returnee moving back to their community, regardless of returnee's profile. So, and I'll talk a little bit about some of these findings, that particular finding in a little bit later, but overall, these results seem to confirm anecdotal reports we've heard from Iraq on the ground that people who did not flee ISIS territories taken over by ISIS and stayed behind are often considered to be ISIS affiliates or accomplices, even if they did not actually support or collaborate with the group. And we actually have some qualitative evidence from our survey that points to that as well, because we asked people after we conducted this experiment why they responded the way that they did. And we saw that when people talked about not accepting stayers, whether it was in Sunni Arab or a Kurd, that they say, you know, if they didn't flee Sinjar, they must have been helping ISIS, they must be a collaborator. Whereas when it came to talking about why they would be more accepting of leavers, they tended to use rhetoric like this last bullet point here, where, you know, I trust them, or I, you know, I assume that he's a victim like me because, you know, he fled Sinjar as soon as ISIS came. So that was our first finding. Our second finding, you know, we wanted to understand, you know, first finding was focused on trying to understand some of the characteristics of returnees and how that can influence the likelihood of social acceptance. This a second experiment we ran was trying to understand, you know, how can you actually maybe improve the prospects of social acceptance in this context? And in particular, we're interested in, you know, does imparting a sense of shared suffering, promoting what social psychologists call an inclusive sense of victimhood among Yazidi respondents by reminding them that a lot of Sunnis were also victimized by ISIS, does that make them more likely to accept Sunni returnees? So previous research has shown that even in intractable conflicts, such as in Israel-Palestine, if you kind of foster these kind of inclusive perceptions of victimhood, it can increase empathy towards other groups, improve attitudes of other groups, and enhance people's willingness to reconcile. So what we did is we randomly assigned our survey respondents into a treatment and a control group, and the control group received no prompt before being asked whether they thought Sunni Muslims should be welcomed into their community and whether they would like having a Sunni as a neighbor. The treatment group received this shared suffering prompt that I put here on the screen, which after, you know, just saying, I'd like to ask you some questions about your opinion towards Sunni Muslims, it says, you know, like your community, many Sunni Muslims lost and suffered through a lot because of ISIS, and, you know, really tried to kind of emphasize that they also suffered as well, to try to kind of impart this potential notion of shared suffering. And in what we found in comparing the treatment and control groups, we see that exposure to this kind of inclusive victimhood narrative did have a significant effect on respondents' willingness to accept returnees, but only really among male respondents. So men who received the treatment were 15% more likely to say that Sunni returnees should be fully welcomed into their communities than men who were not exposed to this inclusive victimhood narrative. So in other words, you know, promoting this kind of shared suffering increased the rate of social acceptance from over a third to more than half of male respondents in our sample. But as you can see from this graph, for female respondents, you know, this kind of invoking shared suffering had a much weaker effect. As with the findings on returnee characteristics, women in general were less accepting of Sunni returnees, and the difference in social acceptance between the treatment and the control groups was relatively modest and not statistically significant. And, you know, we don't know exactly why there is such a large gender difference. You know, we can obviously speculate, and it could be a product of, you know, the particular fear and trauma that Yazidi women and girls suffered as a result of the violence they faced under ISIS. As many of you probably know, ISIS adopted explicit policies that sanctioned the use of sexual violence, especially against Yazidis. And there have been multiple studies that have documented the resulting trauma. One study, I think it was in Germany, found that 80% of participants, all Yazidi female refugees, met the criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. And there's been other research that has found that victims of sexual violence face a higher risk of PTSD and related conditions compared to victims of other types of violence, which can be compounded by, you know, the social stigma and fear of ostracization that survivors can encounter. So it's possible that this trauma could help explain the reluctance among Yazidi women to accept returnees, particularly, again, given that for our first experiment, at least, it was a male returnee. But, you know, I just want to emphasize that more research is obviously needed to explore women's attitudes and perspectives and try to really understand the difference that we found in our survey. And then the last finding I just want to highlight is that we found that intergroup contact was pretty strongly linked to social acceptance. So this is not an experimental result. It's a result of just kind of looking at correlations. But we do find that respondents who fled, who were displaced with Sunnis and reported more frequent contact with them generally, were more likely to welcome Sunni returnees into their community, as you can see. And this relationship held even when controlling for the gender and age of the respondent, and even their exposure to violence. So, you know, this result could lend further support to the notion that shared suffering increases respondents' likelihood of accepting returnees from other groups. Individuals who fled and were displaced alongside other groups may have directly observed the hardships they faced and potentially bonded over their struggles. Or the relationship could also potentially support, the contact hypothesis, which proposes that intergroup interactions can improve social cohesion by alleviating the perceived threat posed by outgroups and dismantling negative stereotypes. But again, further, I think particularly qualitative research would be required to try to understand the mechanisms, to verify that relationship and really try to understand the mechanisms behind it. So the implications of this study, we think, is that it shows that, particularly the result of our second experiment, that, even among, a heavily persecuted population in a polarized environment, it is possible to improve the prospects of social reintegration and peaceful coexistence. And, this isn't a new or groundbreaking observation, but I think it still underscores how, the sustainable return of the displaced not only requires humanitarian and development support to help them recover their lives and livelihoods, though it obviously does, it also requires initiatives that focus on diffusing communal tensions and brokering reconciliation between individuals and groups. So before I turn it over to Mohammed to talk about some of the work that Mercy Corps is doing to try to address some of these and other issues, I want to just briefly highlight some of the recommendations that we provide in this research report, and I'll drop the link into the chat after I finish the presentation. So, first, we think it's really important that various actors, whether it's the Iraqi government, civil society organizations, international organizations, need to make a concerted effort to address the misperception that those who didn't flee ISIS were automatically supporters or collaborators. And one thing we found in other contexts in some research that we've done is that trusted authorities such as religious leaders can be very influential in shaping people's views on reintegration and reconciliation. So in Iraq, these types of authorities should really try to take the lead in countering some of these misperceptions and reducing stigma. Our second recommendation is, some of our results indicate that fostering inclusive perceptions of victimhood through narratives that emphasize both in and out group suffering can improve people's willingness to accept returnees from other groups, which we think offers a promising avenue for reconciliation in Sinjar and potentially elsewhere in Iraq. Now, clearly, and I do want to be clear here, such narratives must be conscious not to create false equivalencies between the experiences of different groups or neglect to recognize, the particular suffering that some groups faced under ISIS, but they should still seek to highlight some of the common experiences and the extent to which many Iraqis suffered at the hands of ISIS. Third, I think this research really highlights the need for restorative justice mechanisms, that aim to promote accountability, but also facilitate truth-telling and empower survivors of ISIS to move forward with their lives. And, we think these mechanisms should seek to repair relations between different communities through constructive and sustained intergroup contacts. Again, looking at some of our findings, potentially illustrating, the promise of increasing the number of positive interactions, potentially, helping promote, positive intergroup dialogue and engagement. And then finally, we would really push donors to expand their investments in peace-building interventions that are sensitive to individual and collective psychosocial needs. These activities should serve as a foundation for efforts to forge intergroup reconciliation and social acceptance in Iraq, and really critically have at their core a gender-sensitive approach. And I think, again, our findings, really underscore the importance of better understanding those gender differences and making sure that, women and girls who were survivors of ISIS-inflicted violence, the type of intensity of interventions needed may differ, and they should obviously have opportunities to shape how these activities are designed, developed, and implemented. So happy to talk about those more in the Q&A, but I really want to turn it over to Mohammed now, who's going to briefly talk about what Mercy Corps is doing to try to implement some of these recommendations and address some of these issues. Mohammed?
Thank you so much, Adam. Before I will go to the talk about the Mercy Corps responses, and specifically in the Sinjar district in Ninawa, because our study was covered this district due to many reasons. One of them, the low number of the returnees in this area, and still there's many challenges to enable or to encourage people who displaced to return back to this area. just I will start to add some of information about the context before I will go to our responses. Maybe that will complete painting the picture that my colleague Adams talked about it, because this study was completed in last summer. Therefore, there's many of things maybe I can add it to the context to complete the picture. The humanitarian, economic, and social barriers still the main barriers to return and obstacle about people to return, including this intergroup the tension between amongst the different ethnic religions division. And in the same time, with lack of government framework to support this area humanitarian, from the humanitarian side, from the economical side, as they said, Mike, the people that said about the compensation law and how to apply this compensation law, because this is many of the issues about that. Move to the another critical thing about fragility or security situation on the ground. This is another barriers adding from 3 months ago about increasing attacks by ISIS sleeping cells in the specifically in the modern border, that's an border between federal government and KRG government. Both of those all of that border started from north of Diyala until Ninawa. This is still the home of these sleeping cells, I'm sorry, from ISIS. And now they are reactivate their operation against the civilians and the security forces. That's added a lot of concern and fear in the communities to return back. Lastly, what happened in October through the tension and the disputes around the October parliamentary election. This is also added the other barriers to people to return, because that's in general in Iraq, because the people start or the parties start to conflicting about the results of the election, but specifically in Sinjar, because this is added to the another layer of the conflicting. This what I can add it to the context in general in Sinjar, and this is the three axes that these three levels that I mentioned. This is added additional barriers to the people to return back to the area. Now I will move to the talk quickly about what Mercy Corps implementing specifically in the Sinjar district belonging to the Ninawa, because as I mentioned, our responses is covering the all Iraq, but this is specifically what we are implementing in Sinjar to try to address some of the finding from this research that already conducted. The first one, we have an Tagir project called Tagir is Arabic Words Change Project, funded by SIDA, Swedish International Development Agency. This project started in 2019 and will be finished in 2022. This project aims to promote peaceful coexist and well-being for the returnees and the host community together in Ninawa generally and specifically in Sinjar, through providing psychosocial resilience and social cohesion through social entrepreneurship at community level, as well as try to do some of the activity related to the livelihood restoration, with focus on youth and specific and women also. Another project that is aligning 100% with this study, and we are trying to address some of the to meet some of the recommendation came from this research. That's a durable solution intervention for social cohesion. 20 started in the mid of 2021 until the project will finish in the first quarter of 2022. This project start to seek the relationship between the different ethnics and religions group through joint economic development social project. These projects start to mix the livelihood with social cohesion, how to promote social cohesion through the livelihood activity through networking and market, and we are working now to establish a roadside market in Sinjar. That will be an platform and hub for people to interact between different groups and to network for that. We are in good progress for implementing this project. Also, this project is funded by the same donor who funded this research, JICA. Move to the another aspect that is important: access to education, how to provide education to the especially to the youth and adolescents who left their opportunity to get education because they stayed under ISIS or they displaced to the area they not provided education very well. This project started in 2019 and will be finished in the within this year. This project provide both psychological support and administrative support to the youth from 12 to 18 to complete their official basic education level, or because this project is working in collaboration with the Directorate of Education in Nainawa and Mercy Corps, one of the licensed organization, international organization in Iraq to manage these accelerated learning centers to provide this type of the education. This education is equivalent to the primary level certificate that provided by the government. That will be one of the supporting to the people, and the unique intervention for this project about providing psychological support to the youth, as I mentioned. Lastly, we are implementing and also another project in the same area related to the building resilience against violence extremism. This project was started in 2021 to 2022. This is funded by BMZ through GIZ. We are working for this project for the people who return to the area, and we are focusing about youth specifically because there is a lot of hate speeches, there is a lot of informations and a lot of things disseminating through social media. This is a project to develop a strong sense of belonging and better understanding of other groups within the community. We are using the social entrepreneurship approach by building people together to work together to understand to other, specifically the youth, because the youth is affected from the what happened in 2014 when the major displacement was happened. That's what I would like to share about that Mercy Corps responses in general. Thank you so much. Over to Elizabeth. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed, and thank you, Adam, for also presenting a very interesting research report with lots of things to discuss. I might encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A or to use the raise hand function at the bottom of the screen, and you can unmute yourself and ask a question orally. Maybe to kick things off, I'll ask a question to each of the groups. You know, I was struck, Adam and Mohammed, as I guess everyone is, by the huge gender differences in terms of receptivity to returnees, and I wonder, Rochelle and Salma, if you found gender differences in this sense of belonging of IDPs, or if you looked at gender as a factor, and also for Rochelle and Salma, if you have thoughts on how shall I say, halfway solutions. We've set it up that you find a solution or you're displaced. And yet your research shows that over years, those people move closer to back home, not back to their homes, but closer. I mean, is there any point in looking at some of these halfway or quasi solutions for IDPs, or does it really remain just a binary, you're displaced or you found a solution? And a question for Adam and Mohammed also about this gender thing. I mean, what kind of gender sensitive programming are you thinking about? I mean, do religious authorities have the same weight or response from female respondents as men do, or are messages more effectively delivered by, say, displaced women returning and talking with women who had not been displaced? But let me turn it over to Rochelle and Salma for your comments, both on gender and on halfway solutions.
I guess I'll start, Selma, but jump in whenever you want. Around gender, we do have things we can say, and I'll ask Selma or Selma can jump in on those. But one of the things that I was struck by in listening to Adam and Muhammad's presentations is how many of the sort of responses of "I don't trust those people anymore" were echoed in our qualitative interviews with people who were primarily Sunni Arabs, but also others. And in part, it struck me that those who experienced violence at the hands of ISIS and who had family members killed, oftentimes in front of them, have those same feelings of "I don't trust them." And in part, I think also because a lot of the violence that happened in not big urban centers, but in rural areas, was done by people that they knew or were somehow connected to or something. And so a lot of what we see in the qualitative interviews is, those were my son's classmates who came and dragged my son out of the house and killed him in front of us, sort of narratives. And Adam was talking about the particular violence targeted at Yazidis. And it somehow, the violent acts itself mirrors some of the things. And so there's some real issues that need to be addressed. And a lot of these stories were told to us by women whose husbands had been killed or who had been taken away or they'd never seen again. And so, and who may have actually even been displaced by people who were members of their own family, distant family sort of thing. So I think there's a lot in terms of what Mercy Corps is doing in this kind of thinking through reconciliation that is really important in general for everybody. Selma, you go ahead, and then I think we can come back to the solutions question. It's a longer one.
Sure. So with respect to gender, so again, the unit of analysis for our studies is the household, right? So they're talking about the acceptance of the family rather than the acceptance of the individual per se. So we do have a subset of female-headed households. They are a lot fewer kind of than the whole group. So we didn't really do comparisons at the household level of female-headed households versus male-headed households on these indicators. We did do a lot of work on kind of challenges that were specific to female-headed households. And actually what it meant to be a female-headed household, whether or not that just meant that the female was the kind of person who was the main source of income or providing the main source of income for the household. So we can discuss kind of challenges that were specific to females, to female-headed households with respect to accessing durable solutions to their displacement, more than kind of whether or not they felt accepted to a greater extent. With respect to the durability or the halfway measures. So again, this was one of the things that we actually found, and this is partly a measurement thing and just partly a kind of a how do we think about return, and what does return mean at the geographic level, at least? And what we saw was that you know, a lot of people who were designated as movers in our study were actually moving back to their governorates of origin rather than the actual districts. And that, you know, over time, those seem to slightly stabilize, and, you know, proximity to is certainly a helpful factor. But again, you know, if we look at the main challenge of housing in particular in displacement, at the end of the day, you know, a big part of actually returning to your actual home is not only that familiarity, but also the cost associated with it, right? So even if you're moving back to your governorate or displacement, you might have, for example, a family network around you. You might have someone who you can stay with that can alleviate rent. You might have someone that can help with the kids, or the kids can go back to school, et cetera. That makes it easier. But that actual cost of, you know, you're still paying for housing where you didn't previously, that's really what is kind of from the financial side linked to that quasi durability of moving back to a to your general area, but not to your actual home. I don't know, Rochelle, do you want to?
I would just add, just really briefly, you know, the whole issue of durable solutions is, and it's really developed over time. I mean, Beth, you have done so much work on this that it's really great. I think we still are, I won't elaborate too much, but I think we're really stuck in trying to understand people's emotions and feelings. And they may not face discrimination, and they may have returned home, but they may still feel displaced and describe themselves as a displaced person. So I think that I don't even know how to take that on, and maybe that is best left to, you know, the people in the humanities and the literature and the poetry people who really do an amazing job. You know, the poems written about these things by people who are displaced but who are back home, maybe is what kind of needs to be integrated into sort of thinking about these things and opportunities to express these things, because as we know, they're so critical. That's all.
And no, I think that this idea of perceptions and feelings really came out in both of your research, the importance of untangling this dimension that's usually ignored in all of our metrics and indicators and so on. And yet, I mean, the results you presented are really striking. Adam and Mohammed, you have further comments on this gender dimension?
Yeah, I'll turn it over to Mohammed to let him talk about how Mercy Corps programming incorporates, you know, gender sensitivity and gender, you know, kind of focused programming. I just briefly want to kind of to emphasize what Rochelle was saying about, you know, this issue, the social divisions and how it's affected social acceptance, and proven to be a barrier to return is not just an intergroup phenomenon. It's also something that it sounds like Rochelle and Salma in your study, but also I know other research that IOM has done, they've documented in, you know, places like Anbar and, you know, within Sunni Arab communities, not just between Sunni Arab and other ethnic and religious minorities. So I think that's a really, really important point, that this isn't just unique to Nineveh. This isn't just a, you know, Yazidi Sunni Arab phenomenon. This is kind of a broader social tension. But I'll turn it over, Mohammed. Maybe you can talk a little bit about how we incorporate gender into our programming.
Thank you for these questions about the gender sensitivity. This is one of the most challenging that facing when we started in this peace building programs in 2017, specifically after liberated some of the area in Iraq, because the issues, especially for when ISIS controlled to the area, that's I will step back for to talk about the communities is divided by tribes, and this is one of the sensitive things about the gender, specifically what happened in Sinjar and in other areas, not only in Sinjar, about kidnapped and harassed some of the women. That's will reflected negatively to the community, specifically to the male and to the female perception. Therefore, we are facing a lot of challenges at the beginning when try to interact between them, but we try to step by step for give a space for them for the trying for all projects for peace building and other projects for stabilization in Mercy Corps to consider the gender sensitivity and to include women as part of that, our intervention, like some of the women-led and identified project, we are give them some space. We are provided some of the psychological support to them, and increase some of the dialogue session for them, raise their voice through our advocacy campaign. We are focusing about women to present their issues directly to the key stakeholders. Just one thing about government, maybe that's just one thing, because the absence role of the government for the all support in this area to enhance return for the issues related to the women or the other issues, that's an absent role of the government. Still, we need to encourage government to play their role actively. We need to from them. Therefore, we led some of the campaign, specifically led by the survivor Yazidi female, to try to present their issues from the community to the key decision makers, because we need to engage and involve government in the solution in the future. That's what I need to mention about that gender in general. Thanks.
Thank you, Mohammed. And we have a couple of questions in the Q&A. I'll start with a question from Amy Holmes, who asked, could any of you comment on whether there are specific challenges in returning to Sinjar compared to other disputed areas such as Kirkuk or non-disputed areas? I think that's probably a question for you, Adam and Mohammed.
Mohammed, do you want to maybe take this one?
Yeah, yes, the barriers to return is different between these, even that's disputes area, like comparing with Kirkuk, like if we are talking about Sinjar, because the external actors is presented in Sinjar. That is an issue. Some of the country are around neighbor the Iraq is they have some of the issues with the armed group there. Therefore, the people if are talking on Sinjar, this is a unique cases that Sinjar is different, because that's situation on the ground is not clear. Who are controlling on the ground? Before I think yesterday, some of the attacks from the Turkey to the PKK members, that's increased the grievances of the people to between their decision back or not back. This what happened in Sinjar for attacking those armed groups, and any clear framework from the federal government in Iraq, and even they are work for this Sinjar agreement that before year. That's this agreement is not implemented yet, and even if the government actors they are saying we are in the process for implementing that, but nothing happened on the ground. I'm talking from the field staff perception and perspective. When I am in Sinjar, I see different security actors without unifying them, and that's increasing what happened in Sinjar. Therefore, if I compare Sinjar with other cities in Ninawa, I see Sinjar is difficult area to return, and if I compare Ninawa with other provinces that have a huge number of returnees, I can say Ninawa is one of the major it's difficult for the people to return there. Yeah, I hope I can answer you, Amy.
Thank you, Mohammed. There's another question here from Paul McKinney. Did the study, or I'll say studies, follow any ISIS-affiliated families who found themselves in displacement camps? If so, did you identify any additional barriers to return for ISIS-affiliated families? And a response from Rochelle that the Georgetown IOM study didn't look at that, but we know that this has been particularly difficult for people affiliated with ISIS to choose to return. Adam or Mohammed, would you like to comment on that?
Our study also did not include any ISIS affiliated families, and obviously didn't necessarily focus on I mean, I guess our study speaks to the barriers in the sense that, you know, it really is the, and I think Rochelle was kind of commenting on this, right? I mean, the, you know, histories of violence, and, you know, particularly when there were previous relations between some of these individuals or groups, in terms of, you know, any hope for reconciliation, and just the fear that a lot of people have, right, about, you know, the idea of, you know, former perpetrators or collaborators or perpetrators, the idea that they would move back to their area. But we didn't incorporate, you know, into our study actual ISIS affiliated families. Mohammed, I don't know if you have any other observations or comments just based on, you know, your viewpoint on the ground.
Thank you. Yeah, I will talk from, it's not about our research, and I will talk from the field experience that I gained from working with the family perceived to be affiliated to the extremism group or / to ISIS. This is other barriers added to the return, because specifically the Yazidi community, they see themselves isolated from the decision that taken to move some families from Al-Hol camp to the Area, and the closure camp for the IDPs is not consulting the Yazidi communities, as they see themselves as most affected from ISIS, and they didn't in a consultant with them. Therefore, this is an added additional barrier for the families, for those families perceived affiliated to the extremism group or ISIS. This is a difficult one, and that's this theme is not. The government not dealing with this theme in correct way. Even now, what happened about increased attacks from ISIS, people, they are start blaming government how to move those people without any of the preparation at the community, and nothing happened. And this is one of the things that increase the barriers of return in Sinjar and in Ninawa in general. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll turn to Rochelle.
I would just say the presentation that Selma and I did about compensation and the importance of compensation, I think is a really critical part of kind of Iraqi general reconciliation, if that's the right word to use on this thing. Because if families who were ISIS affiliated are being returned and are being sort of, the communities are being told, oh, you should incorporate these people, they've, you know, repented or all this sort of stuff. But yet families are still saying, okay, these people get to come back, they're being moved back in by the government, we're supposed to be generous and do these things, and yet I still, you know, these people destroyed my houses and the government has promised me money and we still haven't received anything and we're suffering. And I just don't think the government is making the right decisions in that sense if they can't get this compensation mechanism in place, because you're basically telling people, you've suffered, you know, deal with it, but in the meantime, let the people who made you suffer back into your communities. It just doesn't logically make sense. It doesn't emotionally make sense. And it's in the government's hand. It would be so easy to just provide compensation to all those people who have had, you know, lives and property destroyed. So.
Thank you, Rochelle. Mohammed, do you wanted to comment on that?
Just to add one thing about the compensation law, the issue is not just with the family perceived affiliated, even with the people who are eligible to be under this law to receive this compensation, the process of applying this law is not efficient. Government is not dealing with this law in correct way, and we raise this issue many times to the high decision maker from the people. They require many of documents. This is not. I cannot provide it to them. Therefore, this law, I agree with my colleague about this is one of the key factors to encourage the return to the area, and but the implementation of this law is difficult, and we need many of revisit from the government for that. Thank you.
Yeah, and the issues around the difficulties of applying and receiving compensation are well spelled out in earlier reports from the Georgetown IOM team, that it has not been an easy process. But listen, I want to close us now and to thank these 4 researchers for their presentations on such fascinating dimensions of the issue of return and displacement of Iraqi IDPs. I mean, I think it's clear that if we are going to provide solutions and support solutions, we need to deal with these perceptions and really the agency of IDPs to be able to return and to feel a sense of acceptance, belonging from the host populations. So thanks to the panelists. Thanks also to Maddie Fisher from Georgetown for setting up the webinar, and for all of you who've attended. I hope you've learned something, and we'll look forward to reading these reports when they are eventually published. Thank you.